Before I begin, I always love to share a greeting in the local language of the Gadigal people. And when I greet you, I would absolutely love for you to greet me back using the same word. So in our language, we say warami. Can you mob say warami? Warami. Te deadly. Boy diri kamaru, ngaya bimbibila binui, ngaya Gadigal nyora, ngaya wayenga iora, wanarua, bandilang yora ngaya biana, birigaba gangalu, waka waka, wuli wuli ngaya binui miti miti, ngaya redfern Gadigal nyora. So assuming you all know what I said, I'll just go on. Joking. We say gammon, just joking. Traditional language now, I introduce myself to country. My name is Binui. Binui is an Aboriginal word from my father's people that means Mother Earth, a green place, richness of the land. My mother descends from the Eora, Wonnarua and Bundalang nations of New South Wales. My father's people descend from the Birigaba, Gangalu, Waka Waka and Woolly Woolly nations from central to North Queensland. What does that mean to you? Just means I've got a really big family, and it goes from Redfern to North Queensland. Now, I'm here today with the blessing of my elders, and I'm representing the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. And it's an absolute honour. I feel like it's a privilege to be able to welcome people to country, because we get to share what it means. We get to share about country. We get to share the message of inclusion and reconciliation, which is a beautiful message to be sharing. So in traditional language, we say, Wan gari wurmi, hello and welcome. Wan gari gamarara, welcome my friends. Wan gari Gadigal nyora, welcome to the lands of the Gadigal people. Now for those that don't know, Gadigal land extends from Southhead to Petersham, Randwick to Balmain. They're the kind of approximate boundaries. We don't know exactly, but that's kind of what we can find. Gadi means grass tree. Gal means people or suffix for man. They're the grass tree clan. Totem, Sangowena, Gawara, the whale is the dreaming for this country. And when I say country, I mean the Aboriginal country, not Australia. The Eora Nation, we are one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation here. And those boundaries are the Hawkesbury, the Nepean and the Georges rivers. The Pacific Ocean is the boundary to the east. The notion of acknowledgements of country and welcome to country being a new protocol is not so true at all. My grandmother would always say, these are our ancient diplomatic protocols. And I want to share with you how you can be a part of this ancient diplomatic protocol and keep it going. So, an acknowledgement of country. I want you to find out who the traditional custodians are for the lands on which you were either born or currently living, and to embrace that and use that as a part of your acknowledgement of country, your Australian identity. So in saying that, you would say, my name is, I was born on these lands, or I'm living on these lands, and I would like to acknowledge the lands that you're on. So, that's a challenge for you all. If you haven't done an acknowledgement of country, try and deepen your connection and show your connection to the place that you call home, that we share. With that, I just feel like it's very important now that I just pay respect to elders. Not only the elders of this land and my elders, I pay my respects to each and every one of your elders as well. Because without our elders, we wouldn't be here today. And I want to thank our elders for their strength and their wisdom and their resilience for keeping country and culture alive and strong. I'd now like to share with you that this welcome to country is an invitation to walk with First Nations peoples, not only in the spirit of reconciliation, but in the spirit of keeping this ancient culture alive and this country strong so we can thrive as one people who share country together and we walk side by side into the future. Now, my grandmother would always say to us kids when we were growing up, she would say, our actions today determine the kind of ancestor we will be to the children of the future. My granny constantly reminded us, she would say, we need to ensure that the future generations have the inherent right to fresh water to drink, clean air to breathe, and good food supplies to nourish and sustain all life for as many generations in front of us as we have behind us. Granny calls this being an honourable ancestor. So I challenge or I encourage you all to be honourable in your actions and in your intentions so we can become honourable ancestors to the children of the future. Please know that country does not see colour, gender, sexuality, but country does feel the love and the respect and the authenticity that we each have to offer. So we announce ourselves to country, we ask for country to look after us and to protect us always. And this welcome to country is I would ask the ancestors to ensure that each and every one of you are safe and keep you protected throughout your lives. Thank you for the invitation to welcome you to Gadigal land. In our language, we say gidirigo, which means to receive. We don't really have a word for thank you or goodbye. But to receive with kindness, receive with love, the law of reciprocity, we'd say gidirigo if we were receiving something. So I want to thank you for the invitation, gidirigo. And one last ask of you before I leave. Can you say yano, yano? That means you want to see me again, which I hope is true. Welcome to the lands of the Gadigal people, and may the spirits of this land keep you and your family safe. Yoway.
Thanks everyone, it's really lovely to be here, and having flown in from Adelaide, it's really lovely to be cold. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank you for the welcome to country. Let's see if my clicker is clicking. Which way do I point? Oh, got it, right. Talking to Marie about coming up to do this session with you, we'd kind of been talking about it for a while, but things have been happening at a pace here in New South Wales, and I don't think that I can just talk about the work that I've been doing around rethinking child protection without acknowledging some of kind of the where you're at now. Like many of you, I've been in this sector for a long time, and now that I have been named South Australian of the Year, apparently my age can get published in the paper routinely. But the reason I tell you that I'm getting old is because I know that achieving and sustaining change is really, really hard. And perhaps the hardest of all is when we feel like we've taken a step back. And we lose ground that's been really hard won, changes that we've been proud of. But when we step forward again in that context, and we do, this sector, we outdate any kind of political regime. They come and go. We will have all seen so many different parties come and go. We stand as a sector. And when we step forward again, we step forward with knowledge, experience, and strengthened resolve. Collectively, the child and family welfare sector have achieved significant change over time. And here in New South Wales, I often point to some of the things that have been achieved. And I think when you're stuck in the moment of things that are really hard, and you do feel rightly under attack, that you can lose sight of some of the great successes that you've had. So look at the growth over the past 2 decades in your family support services in New South Wales, an investment that is an envy of so many of the other states. And underpinning it, an ideology that families deserved help and that our child protection system wasn't enough. That's significant. You were nation leading in the transition of care from government to NGOs and ACOs. You've lost some ground here, and the political context is challenging at best, and it can be demoralising. It's at times like these that I really think about what we ask of our families: to be brave, to hold on to hope as they tackle seemingly insurmountable challenges with tenacity and determination. We've all seen families succeeding against the odds, and I can't ask of myself any less than we ask of our families, of victims, survivors. It is really hard right now in New South Wales to think about innovating, to think about creating change, to think about moving forward. But what this sector has taught me is that there's always opportunity somewhere. And so for me, I guess while I always aspire to being a wave of great change, and I think we have to be aspirational, because in great aspiration that we actually do achieve great change. My reality, and I think for a lot of us, our reality is that actually our impact is much more like water on stone. And while I can point to positive change, it's often hard and it feels like it's never enough. But there's something to be said about the strength of water on stone. It's steady, it's unrelenting, and its persistence eventually, quite literally, moves mountains. I'm going to speak today about the transformative change that we need to make in our approach to child abuse and neglect. And I'm going to invite you to think about some of the windows of opportunity we can find to step forward and catalyse change. And recognising the context you're in right now, to lean into your own sense of hope, your resilience and persistence, and the aspiration to do better that drives all of us. And hold on tight, because I am going to start with the challenges. And I'll speak from a national perspective here, because we are not alone in the fact that despite all of our efforts to reform, demand on child protection services continues to be unrelenting and the costs continue to escalate. We've had multiple inquiries across Australia which repeatedly highlight failure in the child protection system. And that's hard. It's hard to work in a system when you keep getting squashed through inquiries that talk about the failure, particularly when those failures seem it's so individualised, as though it's the workforce rather than the system that's failing. Reforms stemming from these inquiries have focused on systemic changes largely designed to prevent families from entering the child protection system. Specifically, we tend to assume that, in the past, our reforms have assumed that risk is incremental. So we try and stop families from escalating into risk, to kind of becoming a child protection family. With that assumption, we've assumed that as risk increases, the size of the affected population decreases. And therefore reports, when we have too many of them, it's that they need screening to find genuine cases in need of child protection. And that if we could just continue to have greater investment in child protection, in early intervention and prevention, that we'd reduce the demand on child protection. I think we've got these assumptions really wrong, and I'll walk through the why. Because despite reforms underpinning these assumptions, our long-term data trends show the numbers of children and families reported to child protection grow rather than reduce over time. Sometimes we have, a good couple of years, but we don't sustain change. And when we look at this in terms of the proportion of the population who are reported at some point during their childhood, it's even worse. So in South Australia, and I'm not saying we're particularly bad, we just keep really good data. So in South Australia, 1 in 3 children, 1 in 3 of every South Australian child is reported to child protection by age 10. And that's up from 1 in 4 children by age 10 back in 2016. So that's following a Royal Commission and new investment. We got more kids reported, not less. And we all know that our First Nation children and families continue to be disproportionately disadvantaged by failing systems across Australia, with some reports suggesting we'll soon be removing Aboriginal children in some states at rates equal to during the stolen generations. And less than a year ago here in New South Wales, the Audit Office's report on its oversight of the child protection system found that the New South Wales child protection was inefficient, ineffective and unsustainable. They certainly didn't get any coaching in how to break bad news. DCJ had not redirected its resources from a crisis-driven model to an early intervention model that would support families at the earliest point in the child protection process, and that DCJ's organisational structure and governance did not enable system reform. So why haven't we sustained change? It's not lack of effort. And it's not that we've actually had no successes. Our sector can point to many successes. But the world keeps changing. And as we've attempted to restructure and reform our response to families in need, the world around us has also shifted and changed, creating new challenges. I think this is part of the narrative we have to hold on to, that actually we are solving a different problem now, rather than this narrative that we've never been enough. So we now have a housing and cost of living crisis. It's a bit got it. You'd think by now I could use a clicker. We now have a housing and cost of living crisis which is pushing more families into poverty and disadvantage, and it has downstream impacts in terms of decision making on removals and restoration. We continue to see devastating impacts of substance addiction on families, with drugs like crystal meth, which didn't exist when I started in this field and has had a devastating impact on the nature of violence that we see in households. The rise of the virtual world has created new and unprecedented challenges for the safety and well-being of our children. I think it's a major issue for our sector in terms of the way we are socialising girls and boys and seeing rising levels of violence and sexual violence amongst adolescent boys in particular. Maybe I have to press harder. And the prevalence of gendered violence remains unacceptably high. And when we consider the challenges of our time, we have to also face the reality that as we struggle to play catch-up, babies are born, children grow up, and when we fail to disrupt disadvantage and support healing, we see cycles of vulnerability that accumulate, compounding over the lifespan and reaching across generations. At the Australian Centre for Child Protection, we undertook a series of case file reviews to move beyond the data on child protection screening to understand what reporters were really worried about when they called child protection. Now, this is a little bit old now, but I've not really spoken about it here before. So in this essay study, we found that the majority of families who were known to child protection were actually reported multiple times. Again, not uncommon when we triangulate across other data sources to other states. We found 1 in 4 families reported to child protection had 20 or more reports to child protection. So single incident involvement was actually by far the minority pattern. And there were clear linear relationships between reports and risk, with reporters reporting the most often about families with the most problems. In fact, the only non-linear relationship we found in all of this research was in the screening decision at the helpline. So that was not related to the amount of risk in the family. That's not because the helpline are getting it wrong either. It's because we look at the incident of the day rather than the global risk within the family. So what we found was actually families with the most reports, they weren't tier 2 families or tier 1 families. They just had the most of everything. They were the most likely to get resources to prevent investigation. They were the most likely to get close no action. They were most likely to get referred out to a family support response. They were the most likely to get screened in. They were the most likely to be substantiated. They were just the most of everything. And in an incident-based system, on some days the incident that was reported got you through the doors, and on other days it didn't. So we've got to really move away from thinking that the helpline screening decision in some way is a good proxy for the need within families. And in another study, also looking at the narratives within the case files rather than the child protection decision making, we found that infants reported pre-birth were being conceived into families with multiple and complex needs. So at the time of first pregnancy for mums, or at the time of third, fourth pregnancy for mums, we were already seeing very high levels of violence. So that really made us think differently about what's our earliest point of intervention. Analysis of linked data by the Better Start group at the University of Adelaide looked at this at a population level and found in South Australia 80% of families known to child protection had a parent under 20 at first pregnancy. 68% had their own experience in child protection and 23% had been in out-of-home care. So our parents, it is not an incremental story of, getting there in time before they enter child protection. Our babies are being conceived into families with multiple and complex needs. And when we looked at this longitudinally, we saw that if those needs were not met, additional risks and needs accumulate over the lifespan at an individual and a family level. So for example, and so with this we looked at what was named in the notification as the concerns about the family. For a 6-month period, 20% random sample in one geographic area, not the best, not the worst area. And then we mapped backwards and forwards. So we kind of went 8 years backwards and another 2 years forwards from that date, and looked at for all the children within the family and the parents, just when problems were first noted, at what stage of the lifespan. So they may manifest later. So for example, what we saw was this, reports were a proxy for involvement and needs accumulated across the lifespan. So, we were having young parents who were reported during first pregnancy. They had their own history of child protection involvement, of trauma, violence, abuse and neglect. And from that first pregnancy, were already experiencing relational violence, mental health concerns, substance misuse. And they continued unless we did something to actually support healing for our mums. And so our bubs then are born into that context where they're then at greater risk of issues during infancy. And again, when we fail to disrupt those risks, greater risk in middle childhood, right through to our babies then being much more likely to be our young parents, 15 to 20, and seeing that devastating intergenerational cycle. But think about this now in terms of a fairly typical child protection involved family. So let's say we've got 3 parents across 2 households, 4 kids, and what you've got then is actually take them as a slice down. You've actually got 7 individuals at different stages of life who each individually have multiple and complex therapeutic needs. Have to move past the toxic trio when we think about multiple and complex needs. It's not the presentation of, or the presence of violence, substance abuse and mental health concerns. It's how they actually manifest in each individual in the family and how we then support our families to change. And I do emphasise that point around therapeutic needs. Now, on the basis of this research and triangulation with other data, at the ACCP we concluded that families with multiple and complex needs are actually our largest population known to child protection. The majority pattern is intergenerational, not incremental risk, as our babies were being born into complexity. And when we fail to disrupt across generations, then the growth is exponential by the kids that we fail. And so there were insufficient services designed for families with multiple and complex needs. So we need to take into consideration the changing nature and growing complexity of our world and the families with which we work when we consider the challenges that we've experienced in achieving effective reforms to child protection. I will also say intervening with families with needs like this, it costs. It's not cheap to achieve change. We need to think about the complexity of need in the context of the scale of the problem and the broader influence of a changing world when we're designing responses. But at its core, the reason we've failed to stem the tide of demand on child protection is because the incidence of child abuse and neglect is very high. The landmark Australian Child Maltreatment Study tells us that 6 in 10 young Australians experienced one or more types of abuse or neglect. So the majority of the population have experienced one or more types of abuse and neglect, with approximately 1 in 4 young Australians experiencing 3 to 5 types, often persisting over a period of years. This is the population that I think we're seeing in our child protection reporting, and I think that's why we've got 1 in 4 or 1 in 3, around that number being reported to child protection around the country. It's not because our reporters are getting it wrong, it's because the incidence of abuse and neglect is so very high. So if we were to actually report all abuse and neglect, we'd see 60% of all Australian children reported to child protection. 60%. I don't think anyone ever envisaged a child protection system encompassing this proportion of the population. So what was our system designed for? Let's just check back. We designed our child protection system in the 1960s to identify what we thought was a low incidence problem. High severity, it was severe physical abuse, children with multiple bone fractures. We created legal powers to require people to report because at that time it was anathema to intervene in family life, to intrude in family business, so we had to mandate people to report. And to investigate and remove children. We grafted that system onto an existing system of institutional care, and we know that our historical care system were tools of colonisation, and we also know there was very high prevalence of abuse and neglect within those institutions. It's not just our families who come with an intergenerational legacy when that door opens. However, definitions of abuse and neglect have expanded over time. Rightly, based on evidence, we know so much more about what our kids need to be raised safely, now encompassing physical, sexual and emotional abuse, neglect, experiencing family violence, with thresholds for what we consider to be abuse and neglect now having expanded over time, again informed by research and changing social values. Those are positive changes, recognising new forms of abuse and neglect. But the reporting expectations have changed correspondingly. So we now report all suspected child abuse and neglect in accordance with those expanded definitions, without a re-examination of the fundamental assumption that all suspected abuse and neglect requires initial triage from a statutory authority. We're not going to shrink child protection if we keep trying to report all abuse and neglect to child protection. This is like saying go to the emergency department rather than a GP as the first step in help seeking. So I think we have to conclude that our system is actually doing what it was designed to do for a population it was never designed to serve. And while we've tried repeatedly to reform this system to get people earlier help, we've never changed that fundamental expectation that all suspected abuse and neglect must be reported to child protection to assess the risk and decide whether to screen out, refer or act. Our system is not fit for purpose. And in fact, there's growing recognition globally that we need to stop reforming and instead transform our approach to child protection, to actually rethink our foundations. But what would genuine transformation look like? Globally, no one has this right. It doesn't mean there's not lots of amazing things happening, but as a whole systemic response, I can't point and say, let's be Sweden. I wish I could. So rethinking child protection needs to involve a willingness to actually think outside of our existing systems, and that's really hard. To embrace human-centred design and be prepared to dismantle and let go of existing ways of working. We don't have all the answers, but I wanted to share a few areas that we've started exploring at the ACCP to help rethink child protection in Australia. Areas where we think real change is within our grasp if we act collectively to secure it. So the first is, I'm going to love my clicker on this one. So the first thing we've been looking at is actually revisiting several of the key theories that have informed our past reforms. In our view, a public health approach remains a fundamental pillar of a transformed system, but we need to rethink how we've applied the public health approach to our service system. Because we made assumptions that our primary prevention population was our largest population, because we didn't have the ACMS. And that our tertiary population was the smallest. And we categorised our service system accordingly, but using the language of primary, secondary and tertiary prevention for services that weren't actually designed as part of a child abuse response has inadvertently created service cliffs for our families and acted as a barrier to child protection really being everyone's business. And I'm actually going to show you what I mean. So in a public health approach, we have primary prevention, which is applied to the population of children and families with no known risks for abuse or neglect. Secondary prevention is for families with known vulnerabilities for abuse and neglect. And tertiary prevention actually refers to interventions to prevent further abuse or neglect in populations where this has already occurred. Now, I've made that really big because ACMS says that's 60% of the population. However, our service system is made up of established services that were designed for a range of different issues and needs. So universal services, is it clicking for me? Yes, great. Universal services describe services, supports and interventions without eligibility criteria, such as primary healthcare, education, childcare. Children and families need to be able to access universal services regardless of where they sit on a continuum of risk for child abuse and neglect. Universal services and primary prevention, they are not the same thing. And when we say it is, universal services can say, we're not for child protection families. The service system also comprises targeted services, so services and supports with an eligibility criteria, such as allied health, disability, family support. Now, disability services, for example, could be providing support to children in families with no identified risks of child abuse and neglect, right through to children in care. And when we talk about universal and targeted services that were designed for another purpose as primary and secondary prevention for child abuse and neglect, we've inadvertently closed doors to children and families in which abuse and neglect has occurred. We also need to rethink how well we're meeting the needs in universal and targeted services of the 60% of the population who have experienced abuse and neglect. If the majority of the population have experienced abuse or neglect, shouldn't all our universal services be designed to incorporate the needs of children or adults with a childhood trauma experience? Should be opening, not closing doors. Turning finally to the dedicated tertiary services, we see a dearth of tertiary therapeutic supports. So think about, this is why I wanted to talk, it was older data, but talk about the multiple and complex needs. Because where's our tertiary therapeutic supports for that population? For the impacts of violence, abuse and neglect across the lifespan. This is a critical gap in our service system that must be addressed. And when it comes to statutory interventions, at the ACCP we've been exploring how a public health approach could actually be supplemented with the theory of responsive regulation, which guides us to be more purposeful about the use of state powers, using these powers only when other avenues have been exhausted. You can see some of our engagement with this theory in this diagram here, where we've drawn from the legal concept of a parent being willing and able as a way of articulating when legal powers would be required to intervene to protect children. So we're not actually suggesting, if you're thinking about responsive regulation, that you would need legal powers for all abuse and neglect. We don't have them overlapping. You need to think about the tertiary therapeutic responses, not just the statutory responses. So responsive regulation, I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It's been applied to a range of issues from road safety to youth justice. So here it is applied to road safety, and a fundamental tenet of the theory is that we should always use the least coercive intervention to achieve the regulatory goal. Similar to public health, least intensive intervention to achieve the public health goal. But what's really interesting to me is that theory also prompts us to engage with the attitude to regulation in order to inform the regulatory response. So when I started in this field, a foundational assumption was that intent doesn't matter when it comes to child abuse and neglect. I've said it, written it, I've believed it. And I think that's totally true when it comes to assessing harm to children. But intent or attitude to regulation, it should matter when determining whether a statutory response is required to secure the safety and well-being of children. Is that right? I should look to my left, yes. So here's an example where Professor Melissa O'Donnell and I have just been playing with the theory, so it's quite new thinking, just trying to unpack this idea and tying in this legislative concept of willing and able. So I'm going to see if I can see this. So thinking about kind of attitude to regulation. If you've got a parent who's willing and able, then we should be providing them help, tertiary therapeutic responses, a house. If you've got a parent who's able to provide adequate care with support, but they're reluctant to engage, then you may want to do some of that light touch, tertiary therapeutic response with maybe your community-based child protection worker. You might need to set some of those bottom lines. If you've got a parent who's unable without ongoing support, then we should be providing long-term support. This is something we don't really do in this sector. We do it in disability, we do it in aged care. We say, don't think you're ever going to quite get there without long-term support, but hey, it'd be better for you and everybody else if we could support you to remain in place. We don't kind of apply that thinking in child protection, and the best we typically can offer is about kind of 2 years in family support. Before that, we're pushed to close there too. Then if we've got the unwilling or unable with support, that's when we're starting to go, well, I do actually need statutory powers to protect these kids, right up to your intentional harm, your cases of child sexual abuse where you are looking at prosecution and a criminal justice response. So reflecting on the theory of responsive regulation, what if we didn't report all abuse and neglect to child protection? I want you to think about 2 different scenarios. A parent who's seeking help to escape a partner who uses violence against them and their child, but who's still living with the perpetrator as they have nowhere to go. And a parent who responds to their child's disclosure of sexual abuse by another family member living in their home with anger and disbelief towards the child. Both scenarios involve a child who's been harmed by abuse, who's at continuing risk of harm from a perpetrator within their home. So it meets your imminent risk threshold. However, in the first scenario, there's a parent who's help seeking, and in the other, the parent's denying the harm. The attitude to regulation is quite different. Do we need to use statutory powers to secure the safety of the child in the domestic violence scenario, or could a non-statutory helping response be effective? Could a professional judgment element to mandatory reporting that enables professionals who are working with families be an enabler to help us shift from a surveillance to a helping system? Which brings me to the role and functions of statutory child protection. Our past reforms have predominantly focused on keeping children and families out of child protection. That's important. Research and inquiries consistently find that the more children and families are known to child protection, the poorer their outcomes. Child protection is not a benign intervention. It should be perceived like a medication with adverse side effects, necessary in some cases, but avoided unless it's truly warranted. But is preventing entry into child protection really enough? Rethinking child protection has to actually include rethinking the role, structure and functions of statutory intervention. I look at our child protection systems, I look at our frontline workforce and how they're there because they want to help, but we have such huge turnover, we have such high levels of work stress, of burnout, not because of the work but because of the system. We need to actually look at the system. So at the ACCP, we're just starting research and exploration into the structure and functions of child protection, what needs to change and how. The voice of children and families impacted by child protection systems will be essential in getting this right. I think this research has the potential to be some of our centre's most important work to date. It's another way of saying I don't have the answer yet. I think we all recognise that we desperately need to rethink statutory child protection responses for First Nations peoples. At the ACCP, Dr. Jacinta Cracker is asking, what would a system designed for and by Indigenous peoples look like? And how can we uphold the right to self-determination within these systems? There's a lot about our approach to child protection that needs change. But we also have a lot of the answers already. I talk about starting with a blank page, and I do that not because I'm about demolishing everything. If we start with a blank page, then we can be much more purposeful about pulling onto the page the things that are serving us well and leaving behind the things that are not serving us well. We need to hold on to our hope, courage and persistence as a sector and proactively work to create the opportunities to implement innovation and prove it works. One of the big barriers we've identified in actually rethinking child protection is being able to have some of the evidence to show the community and ministers that a different approach works. So we have to have the evidence as well. We have to have the demonstration projects. We have to not repeat what we did in the past. Was actually in the 60s, we came up with what we thought was a logical idea and we scaled it globally without testing it. Let's not do that again. So how do we create those opportunities? There is no one answer. As the windows of opportunity, the barriers and the levers for change are different in every jurisdiction. That's been the most amazing thing, that I've been having this conversation in different states and territories, different countries, and kind of what's your first step or steps in creating change? It's different everywhere because your opportunities and your barriers are different everywhere. But here's a few examples of different domains for action. So the first is vision. In South Australia, we're focusing first on creating a collective 20-year vision of a transformed child protection system. It's been the lever that's allowed us to start with a blank page, to step out of the political fray. We've actually got both sides of government going, well, that sounds like a decent idea, I'd like to know what I should be working towards. Leadership in vision creation can come from in or outside of government. I personally think it's best when it comes outside of government because you're not as bound by the politics of the day. The other way there's leverage is sometimes in thinking about issues. So where it's just not okay, it's not safe to put your head above the parapet and talk about a vision for a transformed system. But there's often leverage for action around particular issues. For example, in the Commonwealth, there's money and action around children affected by domestic violence. That's a lever that we can pull. Looking at restoration is another lever that we can pull. Other times the window of opportunity will be in showing how things can be done differently in a particular population, as again that demonstration for how working differently can achieve better results, such as First Nations people, cold populations, parents with a disability. And we also think about population in terms of data-driven optimal windows for intervention, such as responding to childhood trauma as part of that breaking the intergenerational cycle. That's something that we've had real success with the ACCP, with a big philanthropic in Western Australia to create a statewide approach to building capacity to respond to childhood trauma. Adolescents at risk are another key population group if we're thinking about that intergenerational cycle. First pregnancy for parents with a child protection or trauma history is another one we've had success with. And early contact with child protection. Finally, we can think in terms of place, particularly in a jurisdiction the size of New South Wales. Some districts are going to have more enablers to change than centrally led or statewide responses. And as I've had suggested to me in some jurisdictions where perhaps departments were keen but ministers were not, this is a way that they could look at what they called black ops reform. So doing something locally without a lot of noise and then demonstrating the results. And in fact, it's been great to have some conversations before I spoke today because you are doing that. It's in non-government organisations that we see so much innovation, so much of a much more agility and flexibility in the way that you're able to pull services together to actually demonstrate different ways of working. The biggest driver of our current demand in unmet need is the underlying drivers of abuse and neglect in families with multiple and complex needs, and that is where NGOs and ACWAs I think are doing the best innovation in providing coordinated, holistic responses. So as we re-examine what we know and where the gaps are in our knowledge, we, and particularly those with a lived experience of our systems, already hold a lot of the answers about what practice works. In Australia, we're also very privileged to be able to learn from the oldest continuing living culture, a culture that supported children to thrive in families and community for millennia. What we need now is the courage to really listen, to pay attention to what we know works, and to be prepared to dismantle the services and systems that are not serving us well. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, you know, it makes me think about the place-based work that ACWA's doing in Western New South Wales and you know, stepping into that space where no one was working, some intractable community challenges, very high rates of DFE, and you know, the long hard work of building relationships in communities, and how what a difference it really can make. But I'm also thinking about you know, just how revealing your slide was on the, you know, on the intergenerational harms that accumulate and then grow exponentially in multiple generations. So yeah,
I found that one a bit depressing when we first developed it. It really, honestly, it kind of sat really heavily with me. We went and looked at, you know, a massive body of literature to see what was designed for that population of families, and our programs for families aren't designed for that population. In fact, they're almost always the population that are excluded from the evaluation. We don't even have evidence to show that our programs don't work for them. But it's our families who are blamed when we provide interventions that are not designed for their needs.
Great responses. No more reform, transformation, thought-provoking, really curious about the ideas around mandatory reporting. Got anybody else who wants to jump in on the mandatory reporting? Just off the floor, we'll be doing a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I'd really love to. I mean, I think that this is probably the state here in South Australia have led the way in embracing mandatory reporting. So it's a pretty big thing to say, what if we didn't report all abuse and neglect? Did anyone want to jump in on thoughts about that? Are you throwing me out?
I'm Kat Gander and I work at DV West, so we have a lot to do with child protection. But mandatory reporting, I think there's been, it often doesn't support the women or children at all, and in fact it becomes another barrier and children are not as safe as a result of it. Usually it requires women to jump through a whole lot of hoops that around proving their parenting. I mean, one of the latest ones is you've got to, for Aboriginal people, is proving cultural connectivity as part of your plan. And, you know, we just don't see any outcomes that really benefit in the system. And in fact, we see a lot of mother blaming. We often see, because we're obviously a domestic violence service, we often see that the perpetrator is very invisible in our system, and that the onus on the mother to solely keep the children well and protected is where it falls. And that's an enormous failure in the child protection system here.
I always think as well about the procedural fairness. You know, when families get to court and there's the court report, and they'll find that there's been 20 reports and that's used as evidence against them, but they won't know. And often they'll get it, you know, the day before or the day of, and they'll go, this isn't true, or, well, I didn't know all of these things were happening. It feels very, a surveillance system also feels like an unfair system to me.
Kathy Caritas from Western Sydney Uni and Cultural Works. I think the message, Leah, that strikes home to me on reflection, and many people, or some people around here will remember the child protection is everybody's business, and I'm sure that that's not the right language that we want to use today. But that 60% is how do we shift the message so that the public recognises that things are changing, and we're doing snippets of it with domestic and family violence support and family support and so forth, but there's something about shifting that dial and that public messaging that this relates to in the current circumstances, so many more people than what we think. So it's not just on the out-of-home care system or the child protection system that the levers of responsibility are for, and I think that's one of our challenges, that public messaging.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, that's some of the work that we are trying to do as a centre, which is not research work, just talking about this to different audiences outside of this sector, just raise awareness, but also talk about what people can do about it, because we kind of get two reactions when we talk about this problem outside of the sector with broad community members or journalists, and one is it's such a shock they don't believe it. The other is it's so overwhelming that they actually can't pitch it to their editor. The editor won't print it. That's the truth as well. So you've got to really pair it with, and what can you do about it? We've found you've really got to hang here's the problem, here's some broad brush strokes around rethinking child protection. We need a helping system, not a punitive system. But here's things that you're empowered to do to be part of the solution. Otherwise, I just see the eyes glaze, and it's like, well, now I've got to worry about the planet and child abuse. One more question over here.
Oh, not a question, but maybe a comment. Thanks, Leah. I think having worked in out-of-home care for many, many years and child protection, and more recently in early childhood education and care, I think what you mentioned, the analogy about, going to your GP and you wouldn't go to ED, you would hopefully go to the GP first. I think I'm really concerned coming out of COVID and seeing the total increase in the complexity of issues with young children 0 to 5. And the fact that they just cannot get access to services, parents cannot get access to support services, and that's critical. And this is, for people who are probably less vulnerable, who can actually access childcare. So I just think that, that coordinated, holistic approach and getting families access to services as quickly as possible so that they don't end up in out-of-home care.
I agree. It is a massive worry, that the amount of unmet need we have. I think within our sector we have to face the reality of the complexity, because I think it's in this sector that we have the knowledge to come up with the plan of kind of where do we want to go and how do we want to do it. If we don't come up with the plan, if we don't look at alternative approaches, we know what happens, because we've actually got 20 years of data that shows what happens. Those families end up in the child protection system, which is not making them better, costs us a mint for poor outcomes. So I think that's a massive tension, and part of what we have to do is actually build the case for change around. I've looked at where there has been success in change, and it's always come with a balloon investment to shift the balance. But we've got to have the evidence to show it, and that's where I think our demonstration projects, collecting the stories of where things are already working differently and getting better outcomes, the cost benefit when the need is so great. This is kind of some of the feedback I've had in this case for change in talking to ministers. Some ministers who've been really, really blunt with me, and I'm actually grateful. I don't love the messaging, but it helps me to know the problem that we're facing. Basically saying, well, the cost to do that is so great that if I say I'm going to try, I'll never win, and not trying is actually politically a safer bet for me than investing a lot of money and then getting told, like with the National Plan for Violence Against Women, well, you've invested all those millions and you've failed. So we also have to help our politicians to be the best people they can be.
I think one of the things is, thanks for asking that question, Michelle, because you kind of gave the answer as well about basing some of the tertiary services right in the primary systems to make them work much, much better in order for them to be able to be responsive. I think family violence is a classic case where we can do that much better. And where there's less othering occurring now, like that's not one of those families. Most people have families, friends, sisters, cousins who are experiencing domestic and family violence, and I think that actually reduces that kind of stigma, oh, well, they must be one of those families in child protection, where in fact, DV. I think the other thing I just want to say about New South Wales, I have to say, we have the worst reporting culture. I've got Ollie in front of me. Bernardo's, when I came to New South Wales in 1995, was the only organisation who said, this is a waste of time. This is really bad for children and families. And the mighty Louise Voigt, if you remember, used to go on television and say that. And I was like, wow, you know. We've got a reporting culture all over Australia, but it's twice as bad in New South Wales. People report people they're working with. The department reports children to the department. I mean, it's really, really out of hand. And we, in the past, did that because we were using it as a counting mechanism. And we don't need to do that now. We've got the ACMS. I remember saying to Ben Matthews, we don't actually need to think that the numbers that get reported are any reflection to the prevalence. And he said, yeah, that's right. Don't use that system.
We also
don't need
it for surveillance, because actually our data systems are so much smarter now. That's right. Yeah, that's right. They're everywhere. We know where our families are. We don't need to report them to a central helpline anymore to keep track of kids. Our kids are in every data system, and we now have linked data and a whole lot of technical solutions that supersede a centralised helpline.
Okay, so shall we move to the next? Sharon's unwell, but she's saying, come on, girls, wrap it up, keep it moving. So we're going to have our wonderful panel members now. So Grainne and Kat, maybe come on up here. And what's our order for our colleagues? Kat first, I'd say. Your name's there first, Kat. So. And Grainne, do you want to come on up as well? And Leah, can you come and sit here? Because aren't you going to be...
I'm not going.
No, good.
On the stage. I'll do what I'm told.
Yeah, so you're the chair, so let me hand this wonderful mic over to you. Just to introduce our speakers.
Oh, no, I didn't. I blew it.
We wanted to give examples where we thought, and we only got 2 examples, and we know any of you could have been up here talking about work that you've thought about and you're doing, but where we thought people had used some windows of opportunity, either, I love that little square you had, either the vision, the issue, the population or the place, and really worked at doing some things either in the black ops or just great practice that was really, to inspire us about here's some ways that we might think about how to work differently. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm Kat Gander, the CEO of DV West and the author of the Children and Young Persons Framework, and it's lovely to be here. Yes. You do. Firstly, I would like to thank the wonderful welcome to country, and also acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the wisdom, resistance and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Oh, I've got to do 2 screens here. So this is a little bit about the services that we provide at DV West. We cover a large area from Blacktown Hills, Nepean, Hawkesbury and up to the Blue Mountains. On average each year we support around 2,000 women and children, and the average length of time that families engage with our services, if they come through the outreach stream, it's around 5 months. And if they come through an accommodated crisis accommodation, then it's around the 12-month mark. Oh, holy moly. Okay. The Children Young Persons Framework has a long history in its development. I've worked in this sector for over 35 years. In fact, it's actually only 40. And and at the forefront of my mind and practice thinking has been how we work with children. I also bring with me the lens of being a child survivor of domestic and family violence. So specialist homelessness services, which Leah had on the slide as well, is domestic and family violence has been the leading cause of homelessness in Australia since the data collection commenced in the early 90s. And women's refuges have a very unique opportunity to make a difference to children that access our services. In my view, for too long, it has been a wasted opportunity and we need to change that. Domestic and family violence victims are 20 times more likely to engage with an SHS service within the first year of a police-recorded domestic and family violence incident. They tend to have less intensive cross-sector service history, and that often the SHS service is their first point of contact with the service system. And you can see on the right that 76,000 children came through SHS services in 22-23, and half of them had experienced domestic and family violence. Okay, I'm going to have to go back to that one. We did an evaluation of the children and young persons. We did an independent evaluation, was conducted with ethics approval in 2023. And the aim was to explore the framework's implementation, outcomes and impacts. The methodology was a feminist mixed methodology with qualitative and quantitative data, which included 17 semi-structured in-depth interviews, 2 focus groups, feedback forms, surveys with the mothers, and 107 case file audits. So it was a pretty comprehensive data exploration. The demographic in the study was 51% of the children were from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and 18 were from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and the age group was 0 to 17. I'm going to go back to this one because I think these slides might have got mixed up. Yeah. So why a children's framework? Refuges and specialist domestic violence services, I think, are in a prime position to affect change for children and young people and their families, as well as affecting systems change. And simply, there was no guide for services that fitted the way that we wanted to work. Often women come into our services and they're saturated with information of the effects that domestic violence has had on their children, and they're almost they kind of lost all agency over it. They feel really guilty and worried about it. But what we don't provide is knowledge and ways that they can help their children to heal and recover. So, a large component as well in the framework is actually about working with the mother or carer to really empower them with the knowledge of ways that they can help their children. It also really builds workers' confidence and courage and skills, and that's important because child protection for a lot of workers in NGOs can be they just want to tick boxes and they're nervous about making a wrong decision around a child's safety. But doing the having the children's framework, I think, does give our workers an enormous amount of confidence and courage that they didn't have before, and that's very noticeable. It also gives them a lot more courage and skills to advocate across the systems, and they look on ways to really acknowledging ways that mothers have been protecting their children and the strategies that they have been using, acknowledging those, because often the questions aren't being asked in the same way by child protection agencies or being acknowledged. So I'm going to have to flip around a bit here now to hopefully get back okay. The Children and Young Persons Framework is made up of a range of components, including guiding principles, practice responses, and working across multiple domains and systems, such as housing, education, health, child protection, courts, police, etc. And we really work to provide flexible responses, and look at how we can rebuild the relationships that are often been compromised through the domestic violence, relationships with the mum and the child, and also with siblings. We use a developmental ecological model in our collaborative case planning to explore the protective and risk factors across all of the domains of the child's environment, and also taking into account the child's own characteristics and their developmental stage. The evaluation found that the guiding principles for practice drove the work of the children's specialists and were key to the successful outcomes of the program. So I've just got them all up there on the right for you to look to see. I won't go through them all, but they were the principles that we use in the framework. And then the analysis of the case files highlighted the range of services responses that the children's specialists provided across multiple domains. So you can see from the domains that it's a very holistic response, and the approach was found to be distinctive in comparison to other more specialist services, which may focus on one area of support specifically, for example, therapeutic counselling or clinical interventions, mental health, or practical support for safety. But the domains that we're working across in the framework are very, as you can see, we do what needs to be done. That doesn't help. Okay, during the evaluation there are a number of practice responses that mothers' carers described as being really important to them and their children. And there are the responses up there that women, the mothers or carers fed back. So our first finding was that 100% of the mothers reported receiving a poor service response in the past, which led to a reluctance or difficulty in accessing services, and this included a mistrust of the broader service system altogether. After being in the program and at the end of when the evaluation took place, 100% of the mothers actually reported improved access to support services for them and their children. So that kind of walking beside advocacy, I think we could see some incredible changes in the way that mothers or carers were interacting with the system. And I've just got one example of this, which is, there's so many, and I know there's limited time, but this was one example where, the family were in the safety action meeting, so they'd been referred into there, and the mother was continually missing medical appointments. So the safety action meeting was investigating medical neglect, but we were aware that with the mum as well, that the reason was the perpetrator kept hiding the car keys from her, so she would miss appointments. He didn't want the children going to a doctor and having that opportunity to talk about what was going on, so they kept being hidden. So in the end, instead of it going from we're going down this pathway with her and the woman being able to stand up as well and say that, you know, they arrange for taxis to come and pick her up to go to medical appointments. That's just one small example, but we've got hundreds of those where changes have been, the change in women's agency is really, you know, it's really very noticeable. So this was, you know, probably not a surprising finding, but that, you know, 88% of the children experienced attachment issues, and 72% of the parents, the mothers or carers, said that their parenting skills were disrupted by the domestic and family violence. And after going through the program, 100% of them said they had a better understanding of their strengths and their protective strategies. 66% improved bond between the child and the mother or carer, and 64% improved skills in parenting, and 52% improved understanding of the impacts of domestic and family violence on their children. And what's important about that is that, you know, every child's experience is different, every child is different, and we're really encouraging the children's program for parents and children, if it's age appropriate, to communicate what's happened and what they've experienced. So that gives the mum a better idea, instead of having this overall thing of all of these things are going to have been what my child's experienced, and these are going to be the outcomes for them later in life. Yeah, so. And this one, it was looking at the child protection risk factors, which, you know, of course, many of the families in our services are involved with, have child protection involvement. At the time of doing the evaluation, all of the women in our services and the children have experienced domestic and family violence. And 30% of the children had an open file where they were actually had been assessed at risk of serious harm, and many were at risk of removal due to the perpetrator's violence. And even though they'd say they don't do this, we often do get families that are brought to our service, and they're told, if you don't leave and go to and stay in the refuge, we're going to remove your children. And yet in that group that was involved in this study, 86% of the families still had contact with the perpetrators because they couldn't work out safe arrangements around that. And 74% of them had current active legal matters, and 45% had ongoing issues with ADVOs or protection orders, such as trying to add their children to the order or responding to breaches. So these findings highlight the systemic barriers mothers face in seeking protection for themselves and their children from the perpetrator, even after they have been directed to leave or the children will be removed. Even then, our system does not join up. They're really, you know, left out in circumstances where protecting their children is actually their sole responsibility. They need to do it, but there isn't really the systems that you think would come there to provide that protection, even when there's been that level of DCJ involvement. Now, this next slide was from a study. There's two studies that we did, and look, we just asked the same question twice, the same questions twice. In the first study, it was done in 2022, and the second was undertaken in 2023 after the Children and Young Persons Framework was implemented. So you can see the changes. We did add one additional question in the second study, but study 2 shows a significant increase in the knowledge, understanding and confidence mothers or carers had in supporting their children and recognising and appreciating their own protective actions. I mean, some of those figures are going from being, 68 to, 85. So really a big change. I don't know why. Okay. That's gone back. Okay, it must have gone the wrong way, sorry. I'm quite dyslexic with left and right. Blame it on the domestic violence. Okay, so it's one back. One of the wonderful things about our program is that we have a holiday program, an activity program, and the aim is to create positive new memories for families and individually for the children and young people to reduce the trauma, but also to have that, to create that connection outside of the violence, to support and to re-establish that relationship and reconnection that is commonly being compromised. And, sometimes families say, oh, no, we can't go on a holiday, we're in crisis, but we arrange for them to go on a holiday. And what's amazing is the experiential learning that happens. Often families haven't been on a holiday. We always do feedback forms from those holidays for the children and the mum. And, they're always quite surprising things that happen, but commonly it'll be, never seen mum so happy and smiling. We played games together, we didn't fight. We're going to now go bushwalking every week now that I know that bushwalking is something the kids really like. So they take into their lives new traditions and new routines. They may have never been playing games before together. We often send them off with games and they say we're now having a fortnightly games night. Sometimes people go back to the same place because they've worked out how to catch a train or to get to that location, and they're doing activities there that they haven't done before. Sometimes with Aboriginal women, they're part of the coercive control has been not being able to have contact with the matriarchal side of their family, so arranging for the family and the children to go back and have a visit on their country. And we're really flexible of what that holiday can look like, but the outcomes for it are, it's something really special. Okay, I think I'm lining up here. So, advocating for a long-term collective vision. I think we need to change the practice to partner with the victim survivor of domestic and family violence as opposed to partnering with the system. And that's, there's so many systems involved for domestic and family violence survivors, including children, that being able to partner with them and, not be so kind of intimidated by the system that's all around it, I think is something we could really make a difference if we did. Eradicating gender bias and mother blame from the child protection system and the broader housing, health, justice and legal systems would make I think it's something we all need to have as a collective vision. It still happens. Police attend and say, well, why aren't you letting him see his children? Even though it's obvious, even in cases obvious that she's been physically beaten. This is in 2025. We still have these attitudes across our system. And we also need to challenge the misogynistic data collection systems. Currently, data collection genders the responsibility of the safety, stability and well-being of the family solely on mothers. Perpetrators of domestic and family violence pretty much remain invisible. So, and when women end up going to the family law court and their files get subpoenaed, there's so much data on them, and you look at the file that's going up for the perpetrator, and if police haven't been involved, which we know in many cases they haven't, there's actually nothing on the file. So, like for us, the Specialist Homeless Service, we have a really good data system, but there's nowhere, the only thing that there is on our data system to do about perpetrators is to put a red flag and their name if you think they're an ongoing danger. We really should be collecting the impact that perpetrators are having on that family in the long term, because that always determines the long-term outcomes for... And the other thing that we really want to do, we want to implement one of the recommendations from the evaluation report was that the children's specialist domestic and family violence work within a refuge context be acknowledged and supported as an effective child protection and early intervention strategy, and that the children and young persons framework alongside the Safe and Together model be considered an exemplar for work with children, young people and their families in the future sector and service development training. We'll be doing our 4th edition of the framework this year, and we're developing training to go alongside that to be available to the sector that we will pilot. And then we have just a quote from a woman who had her children removed, and they were waiting with a birth alert to remove her baby, and then she kept her baby, and she also now has her other children restored to her care. So one of the things I don't get time to do in this is also the amount of work that we do towards restoration of children as well. So look, that's me. Thank you so much. If you want to download the report, go to the DV West website. There's the evaluation, or scan the QR code. Thank you so much.
So whilst I'm waiting for my slides, I just also want to acknowledge the acknowledgement country today. It was really beautiful, inspiring and so authentic, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and those attending today's meeting. I do have the privilege not of having been born in Australia, but certainly living on beautiful Gadigal land. Thank you. So a slight change of pace, but hopefully it pulls some of these conversations together, and I do feel that Karitane is a health-based organisation, so I'm going to come from the other end of the service system as I speak. Sharon, can I just check, because I think we are a wee bit over time. There's 21 slides. How fast do I need to go? We've got a little bit. Okay. 8 minutes. I'm Irish, fast talker. Well, we'll see how we go. Okay, so I won't dwell a little bit on Karitane. We've been around for 100 years. I've been around for about 10 of those. So sometimes it does feel like 100 years, I'm sure, for many of us in our organisations. But we do focus on the first 2,000 days, the 0 to 5, and we've talked a little bit about the service system. And Leah, your notes from universal, secondary and tertiary, and what that means in a health system and also in a social services system is quite different. But we do meet in the middle on this strange continuum of care that we all work on. And we do see that in universal services, we do get complex families, and how do they navigate this huge and complex ecosystem. So that's probably what I want to talk about today. So the principles of integrated child and family hubs. Hands up who's heard about child and family hubs or heard that as a term or a mention, something coming into our language. And they are supposed to be the utopia, the one-stop shop for families. You can come there and you will get absolutely anything and everything, and one will exist in your place-based territory, and we'll have a beautiful workforce that can do it all. So once we've conquered that little challenge, I mean, what it really is about bringing the service system together, the state and federal service systems, we're all funded, we all have organisations, we all have amazing services, but they are siloed. And as I get to one of the examples later on of one of our hubs called Village Connect, I've got my colleague Louise from Uniting, so feel free. We'll talk about the reality of navigating that really complex system for priority populations. So hubs are designed to reduce barriers to access, to provide stepped care support, and to identify families at risk from those very early years from pregnancy, and those who may have been intergenerational elements. It's like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time, isn't it? So we're part of the National Child and Family Hubs Network. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's a national organisation that's been led by MCRI. And whilst Karitane's got about 8 hubs, there's about 476 hubs on the last count from Social Ventures Australia and Deloitte that actually exist across the country. And they come in all shapes and sizes. And we will talk about a few of them today. The one that I want to talk about, or two, is the Fairfield Integrated Child and Family Hub, which has been co-funded by the Paul Ramsay Foundation and also the New South Wales Government, and also our Village Connect Young Parents Hub. So this will hurt your eyes. This is an ever-changing model that we keep adding to. I'm just going to expand my own version. And I want to walk you through this because it's sort of pivotal and brings in many of the elements of what Leah's been speaking about. You do have this on your table. There's a handout on your table, and I'm also very happy to share this. But if we start left to right and we start at that prenatal, perinatal, and we look at the first 2,000 days, and we look at the types of services and screenings and touch points of families on the left, and we start to identify parenting and family needs and babies and children's needs. And they do get sifted and sorted through your various intake systems. It's a no wrong door, any door you come through. But we do look at the 0 to 2, the 2 to 4, and the transition to school. And in the middle, in that 0 to 2, you'll see that there's triage, there's navigators coming in. Anyone got navigators in their models of care? Not yet. So people who are helping families to find their way through this complex system. And there's e-navigators, there's Ask Izzies, there's help directories. There's so many ways to try and find your way through the system that you get lost trying to find your way through the system. Over to the right, the big sort of ecosystem map, if you like, is where we bring ourselves all together. Health, foundational supports, NGOs, early education providers, domestic family violence, all with many underpinning similar principles of trauma-informed practice, strengths-based care, and looking at the social determinants of health. And the idea is that we are trying to design hubs and services that encompass as many of those elements as we can. And as Leah said, creating the evidence for these models is super important. So there are a group of us, MCRI, University of New South Wales, University of Sydney, Paul Ramsay, Ingham Institute, and many, many others actually, Queensland University, Thriving Queensland Kids, that are working right across the country to look at, these various hubs. There's e-hubs, there's primary care hubs, health hubs, NGO hubs, education hubs, and social care hubs. This is the model, and I guess, Leah, it sort of talks to your model from earlier, that it doesn't necessarily mean that families in universal services don't have complex issues, but there is that sense of funneling people through this tiered reverse pyramid up to hubs and care navigators to get what you need when you need it during that first 2,000 days. To do that isn't easy. We all work in organisations, we're all driven by boards, and we talk about partnerships and we talk about collaborations. But I can tell you from running these hubs, these partnerships don't just happen by osmosis. And in fact, building our workforce and building our organisations to work in partnership is actually a whole shift in the system in itself. So we've been committed to looking at the partnering cycle and to educating and training people in how to work effectively. It takes more than passion, and how do you sustain it, actually? So we know that there's many organisations that have a leader that's passionate about something, and that leader goes, and then how does it get integrated? So these are the differences in partnerships from very transactional. We've got a service contract, we've got an MOU, so we must be partners, funding partners, compliance-based things. But what we're really trying to do is get up to the collaborative end. It's mutual, it's layered, it's collaborative, it's shared, and it's alliance-based. So that little tagline, together we can make it life-changing for families, but what does together look like? And how can we achieve it well? So I wanted to give you an example of Village Connect. And Village Connect is in southwest Sydney. And as I say, Louise is here from Uniting, who's one of the partners from Karitane. It was came from the Department of Communities and Justice, who initiated this. It's about 3 years ago. Based on a lot of co-design and, in fact, input from our First Nations community, that what works best for First Nations communities will work best for all of us. And this is a really animated video, but I won't show you in the interest of time, about the different elements of Village Connect. Now, Village Connect is for young parents, a priority population, but in co-designing and naming it, the young parents said, we don't want to be labelled as young parents. We are parents and we've got needs and we want to work together, but it's quite stigmatising. And so they've called it Village Connect. There's quite a lot of text on this, so it's, we'll circulate this afterwards, Sharon, so that people don't have to read everything. But really, the critical elements are that we've got the Child and Family Hybrid Hub, so lots of parenting wraparound supports. We've got a key worker model that's led by Uniting, and we've got a 24/7 health, wellbeing and safety support app provided through an organisation called Sonda. And I do laugh because sometimes in integrated care hubs what you do is you pick your partners, you co-design, you work for ages. This was like an episode of Married at First Sight, in that DCJ said, these are your partners, these are you're working with. And in fact, in the lead up, and also having quite a rushed impact to go live, here's your funding, get going. So there was a lot of building the plane whilst we were flying it. But we have lived to tell the tale and learnt many things. That is what the model looks like in practice. So the key worker builds trust. Not every young parent meets a threshold to get a key worker, so there's referral criteria that work through the team, but we then link the key worker to navigate them through the system and the resources that support the parenting journey. The Child and Family Hub is your sort of parenting support, parenting capacity building, kids' behaviour clinics, speech, allied health, etc. And the universal access, I think one parent described it as peace of mind in her pocket. So being able to connect to someone in the middle of the night, baby's got a rash or feels sick, and who does she call? That's the Village Connect team, so a big team of allied health and other support workers, and I'll flip past that. This is what I really wanted to show you. The ecosystem for the young parents to navigate. And even though we are 3 service providers, this is the plethora of systems and connections that our young parents are trying to navigate alone. And this principle works for all priority populations. So we've got playgroups, we've got early education, we've got sleeping, settling, feeding, we've got GPs, we've got schools, a real myriad. And this is where the navigators and the key workers actually play their critical role in this ecosystem. And so we talk about empowering parents and families, but the truth is, in fact, we don't even know what's in our system. Our navigators have to work really hard to find out what exists. And that's a footprint around Macarthur in southwest Sydney. So you can multiply that across New South Wales and across the country. And so somebody said, I don't think we should have navigators, Grainne. We should have a system that's not too complex. And I said, well, that probably is utopia, but right now we do have a really complex ecosystem for families. I might just skip over the reasons to... Did I turn that off? Did you turn me off? Oh, okay. Reasons to refer. So various reasons. So as I say, there's no wrong door. It can be as little as new arrivals, refugees in the country. They're isolated. They want to speak and meet their community. And for the young parents, we recently had a question about, can this hub just be a hub for priority populations? And we had quite a good discussion amongst ourselves and also with DCJ, was that the young parents co-designed this. They said, look, I've got different needs. There's peer workers, peer-related issues. I don't feel the same if I'm sitting in a supported playgroup with a mum who's in her 30s, not going through the same things that I'm going through. So there really is something about the peer experience and the peer workforce. So the key insights. Again, these are quotes from mums and navigators in the system, and I'll send these through so that you can read people's feedback. But really it's about building trust and rapport, both between service providers but also for the families. People didn't want to have to tell their story 3 times, 4 times. I was looking at the screening that we all do at different points of care. So how do we share data information? And consent became a big thing. So the young parents say, oh, I didn't realise if I told you my story that you were going to tell that person and that person my story. So really empowering parents to say, I want people to know this much of my story, and I'll give you permission to share other bits as it becomes apparent. Some more beautiful things about a lot of things just focus on how your kid is doing. They kind of forget about mum, and a lot of things even more forget about dad. Coming here though, it includes everyone. It's like your whole family. And the relationships between partners definitely influence parents' outcomes. So one mum said, they've supported me through everything. I recently left the kids' dad and they helped me with that. They helped me find a rental. They helped advocate for that. They're helping advocate for my son with all his autistic needs right now. So that real holistic approach. And this is shared with love and gratitude, and a beautiful piece of bespoke Aboriginal artwork that was co-designed especially for the Village Connect young parents. So thank you.
So any questions from the floor? Over here. Right, do you want me to come to you?
Just quickly, it seems to me that the NGO sector is working in a far more relational care perspective than the statutory organisations, like that example you gave, which is all, the keys or whatever it was and things like that. There is a space here, I think, for DCJ and the statutory organisations to work in a more relational way, and I know that it's not happening at the moment, but in Norway, for example, the caseload is 7, and here I was talking to a caseworker today and she has 18, so those kinds of things, but really engagement is a crucial aspect here, I think, from our statutory organisations to bring these people along and to ask them a lot more what they need, not tell them what they need to do. So it's far more of an invitational experience, but it needs a lot of work, it needs a lot of cost. I'm involved heavily with family group conferencing. It's been rolled out, but it's patchy. It's not resourced enough. You can have good facilitation and training, but then the review work and the resources to meet that family plan are not often there. So I think there is a space in the statutory area to do a lot more work around this kind of way you're talking.
I mean, I think obviously you're right about the investment, but what kind of shines through for me and when I'm talking to frontline workers within child protection is the power of practice and the power of individuals without a different amount of resources to show up differently, and just how much difference that can make. So that really shone through in both of those case studies, was kind of that the power of practice to make a difference. Other questions? Or just reflections. Are there themes that are cutting through for you in what you've heard, that kind of, or principles? Greg.
I have a question around what are the hopes or aspirations for the new coercive control legislation in the work that you're doing with domestic and family violence?
Great question. To give you an idea, say in the area that we're in, where the police have said they're not even going to put forward charges until they see some test cases go forward. So, like at this particular point, we're not seeing it make the impact that we hope it will make in the future. I think it will make a big difference. I mean, sometimes people have the view that this is some new behaviour. It's not new behaviour. It's actually something that we've been trying to describe for decades, but we've really only ever got purchase if there's been physical injuries, whereas coercive control can be, have such a major impact on the victim survivor's life. So our hopes is that police training and responses to that will be taken more seriously. At this point, we're not seeing a lot of difference in that. We know that women have got higher expectations, so they're documenting a lot more of their experience and what's happening, and we're encouraging to do that. But it's also discouraging when they go to the police and say, these are all the things that have happened, this is the evidence I've collected. And they're saying, well, we're not ready to respond to that. I know there's been a couple of successful cases. I think it's a bit of a watch and see space.
Other questions or reflections? I mean, one of the things that really came through for me across both of your presentations was we're talking about really, really complex issues, but for both of you, there was a sophisticated simplicity in what was actually experienced by clients and how powerful that was. And for me, that came through when you talked about clinically all that the camps did. But actually for families, it's that sophisticated simplicity of a camp and how transformative it can be. And in your example of just co-designing with the young people spaces that felt right for them and that purposeful support to navigate a complicated system, again, sophisticated simplicity, delivering kind of big change. I think sometimes when I put up that trajectory slide, it can feel really overwhelming about what to do for families. But for me, kind of for both of you, what lands on the ground doesn't have to be as complicated as what our families are experiencing. Other reflections or questions from the floor?
Just in response to that, I think we try not to use the word complex in our service because often it describes nothing and it can be a reason to do nothing. It's too complex. Oh my God, there's so many complex issues. Like, well, let's get specific about what the issues are and how we can help. So we actually really try not to use complex issues.
Yeah, I would also add to that, when you look at stacking the odds, and we can really get tied up on the adverse childhood experiences and the things that stack up on that side. But when we actually look at the beneficial childhood experiences and the hope and the resilience, in fact, some of the families with many more challenges that we think might overwhelm ourselves, in fact, the resilience and the hope and the trajectory that comes from that is really inspiring, actually, to see. And so that's why the peer worker model and really authentically listening to the young parents has really reshaped away from that expert model of we've got all the answers. It really has shifted it. We did do some workforce training as well in the common approach, and I think that was really important. So we actually made sure that, from family partnership models and reflective practice and relational practice and the common approach, that the entire team, from the admin staff to the front line, were trained. Yep.
Melissa had a question. Thank you.
I was just going to ask, for both of you, what was, often these, after the passion comes the work, what was kind of one of the tough stuff where you thought, oh gosh, this might fall in on itself with all those places to refer to, God. Or you, Kat, when did you think, this, whether it's a particular case where things don't go well or whatever, if either of you had times when it was really tough to sustain the changes that you'd made to practice and other?
I think that probably the tough part was no generally, because I think we felt very confident about that we were going to make a difference, so we didn't have a moment like that. But we did have some times which was really useful of looking at how we worked, because often women that come into women's refuges are concerned about a children's worker. They think, well, is this going to be like a risk, because they don't want someone to be alone with their child, which is fair enough. So we changed a lot of the ways we work, because we have a part of DV West. We have Wirrawee Gander, which is an Aboriginal specific service within DV West that has all Aboriginal staff, and they have different ways of working. They've got a level of autonomy within that. And so for them, they decided to call the children's workers the family connection worker. So, I think there were things like that we thought that's not working, that we changed, but I don't think there was anything. I think that we got surprised by some of the outcomes, but more than we did by the difficulties. Yeah.
It's hard to pick which one. There's definitely a few, and it's not easy. So there were some times when there was tensions between the partnerships, organisational tensions versus the collaboration partnership. But again, that way of working through that was maturing, and as staff come and go through the program, really making sure that there's a sustainability to keep up with that collaboration, integration, and so I think there's a piece of that. And then there was probably a little bit with the peer workers and the young parents who are actually working on the team, of oversharing and knowing what their boundary was. So there was a wee bit of that happened from time to time, but it has really been that real learning cycle, and we're still learning and maturing, so it's great. Yeah.
Hi, thanks everyone for your presentations. I was just reflecting as you were talking, both Grainne and Catherine, on some of what Leah had presented earlier about thinking, and in the case of mandatory reporting, thinking about shifting systems and thinking about what sits behind that to enable that shift in systems. And often when we're trying something new, we're asking for organisations or for systems to hold risk in a different way. And of course that, we ask families to hold risk all the time. We know what the outcomes are of our services, yet we're willing to maintain some levels of risk where it sort of sits with our general status quo. But it can be challenging to get that buy-in to enable the system to hold risks and to do things differently. And I'm really interested in, particularly for you, Grainne, because I think you've just gone through this process of getting that buy-in, negotiating, really supporting that political will and investment. What helps to create that change from your perspective, and thinking about the call to action that Leah made earlier? What can we do as a system and as players within that system to help create that political buy-in to really accelerate that change?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Look, I actually think we developed a coalition of the willing from across the sector. So we didn't go alone. There was a body of evidence and pilots to take, and we looked internationally at the UK and other places, knowing that our system's quite different. But what were the learnings enough? And in fact, philanthropy, I'm working with the Paul Ramsay Foundation and Social Ventures Australia, and looking at the data on, we're not changing the dial on the pockets of disadvantaged place-based work. So I think there was probably a focus on there was timing, focus on the first 2,000 days, a sense of the continuum of care coming together. So families operate in an ecosystem, not in a vertical health system or an NGO system. They work across us all, and the early education system. So there was the National Early Years Strategy, there was some shifts at the reform level that felt like there was an appetite to have it, and then it was ground up. So who's sort of in, and how can we connect across the country to talk at a federal level, and then also with the state governments. But it's taken a while, and we know that systems change takes time. but somebody has to go first and sort of break the mould. And a lot of the stuff has been research-based and then not sustainable because research funding has, run out. So it's really now about creating sustainability and future-proofing and growth.